Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. In the serene suburb of Pinewood Hills, where every lawn was manicured and every smile seemed genuine, a hidden storm brewed. Josh Carmichael, a family man and community favorite, thought he'd built a dream life and the perfect backyard pool. But when HOA President Karen Dalton set her sights on his paradise, chaos erupted. Josh Carmichael had always been the kind of neighbor people looked up to, a thoughtful man who wore his decency on his sleeve. At 40, he had built a comfortable life for himself and his family in the serene suburb of Pinewood Hills. Known for its pristine lawns, uniform mailboxes, and tight-knit community spirit, Pinewood Hills was governed by a well-established homeowners association, HOA. For Josh, it was an ideal place to raise his two children, 12-year-old Tommy and 8-year-old Sophie, with his wife, Lisa, a dedicated college lecturer. The family had spent the last 5 years blending seamlessly into the neighborhood, with Josh at the center of every gathering and barbecue. One of Josh's passions was hosting monthly cookouts. Neighbors would gather in his backyard, savoring smoky ribs and sharing laughter under the soft glow of fairy lights. It wasn't just a meal, it was a tradition, one that cemented bonds among the residents and reinforced Pinewood Hills' reputation as a friendly and cooperative community. Life had been good in the neighborhood, but things began to shift recently with a change in leadership at the HOA. The former president, a laid-back and well-liked retiree named Paul Benson, had stepped down due to health reasons. His successor was Karen Dalton, a middle-aged woman with a sharp tongue and a reputation for micromanaging. Karen was not universally liked. She had a way of making people feel as though they were perpetually falling short of her expectations. Josh had been wary of her even before she took office, voting for a different candidate during the HOA elections. Despite Karen's imposing demeanor, Josh didn't anticipate much trouble. After all, he'd never had issues with the HOA before. He followed the rules, kept his lawn manicured, and participated in community events. But Karen had a different vision for Pinewood Hills. She was determined to leave her mark, and Josh, unknowingly, was about to become the center of her schemes. The Carmichael household was buzzing with excitement that summer. After years of planning and saving, Josh had finally constructed the backyard of his dreams. At its heart was an extraordinary swimming pool, complete with shimmering blue tiles, programmable LED lighting, and a small waterfall that created the soothing sound of cascading water. The pool was more than a luxury. It was a gift to his family, especially his children, who had begged him for years to make it happen. When the construction was complete, Josh couldn't help but beam with pride. The pool became the talk of the neighborhood. Some neighbors complimented him openly, admiring the way it elevated the beauty of his already picturesque backyard. Others, like Karen, observed silently, calculating the implications of such an addition. Karen's first visit came unexpectedly one sunny afternoon. Dressed impeccably in business casual, she knocked on Josh's door with a confident smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She complimented the pool effusively, calling it the crown jewel of Pinewood Hills. Josh, while polite, couldn't shake the feeling that her compliments were leading somewhere. "I've been thinking," Karen began, her voice warm but edged with authority. "A pool like this could be such a boon for the community. Imagine hosting neighborhood swim parties or kids' lessons right here. It's such a waste for it to just sit there, used by only one family." Josh was stunned. The pool was a deeply personal project, born from years of effort and savings. It was meant to be a haven for his family, a reward for their shared dreams. He calmly but firmly declined Karen's suggestion, explaining that the pool was private property, built for his family's enjoyment. Karen's smile faltered momentarily before reappearing, a shade more forced this time. "I understand," she said sweetly, "but it's something to think about. Sometimes, making small sacrifices can strengthen the bonds of community spirit." With that, she excused herself, leaving Josh uneasy. Though Karen had left without argument, something about the encounter didn't sit right with Josh, and unbeknownst to him, this was only the beginning. The pool he had lovingly built was about to become the focal point of an escalating neighborhood drama. A few days after Karen's visit, Josh Carmichael began to notice subtle but unsettling changes in the atmosphere around Pinewood Hills. Where his neighbors once greeted him warmly during his morning jogs or waved as they passed his house, Some now avoided eye contact. Others whispered just a little too loudly when he walked by, their glances lingering on his newly constructed backyard. At first, Josh dismissed it as coincidence or harmless curiosity about the pool that had quickly become the talk of the neighborhood. His unease grew when his next-door neighbor Tom Grayson stopped by one evening. Tom was a longtime friend, someone who had shared beers over countless barbecues. But now, Tom looked hesitant, almost apologetic. "Hey Josh," he began, shifting awkwardly. "Have you seen this?" He handed Josh a folded piece of paper. The letter was printed on HOA letterhead and signed by Karen Dalton. In it, Karen enthusiastically described Josh's pool as a potential community resource, claiming that she had discussed with him the idea of opening it to the neighborhood. The letter stated that Josh had initially expressed interest, but had suddenly withdrawn support, leaving Karen no choice but to inform the community of his decision. The letter was laced with passive-aggressive language. Phrases like "unfortunate missed opportunity" and "detriment to neighborhood unity" stood out starkly. It ended with a suggestion that residents might wish to persuade Josh to reconsider, alongside a glossy photo of his pristine pool, likely taken from an angle that only Karen's backyard could provide. Josh's stomach sank as he finished reading. "I didn't agree to anything," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "This is a lie," Tom nodded, sympathy etched on his face. "I figured as much. Karen's been stirring the pot since she got elected. But you should know, not everyone's on your side. Some folks are already grumbling about why you won't share." Over the next few days, the fallout from Karen's letter became impossible to ignore. Neighbors who had always been friendly started dropping veiled comments about selfishness and community spirit. Others, like Tom and a few longtime residents, quietly expressed their support for Josh, acknowledging Karen's tendency to manipulate situations to her advantage. But not all interactions were so kind. During one tense conversation at the local park, a new resident named Elaine confronted Josh directly. "I don't understand why you're being so difficult," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "It's just a pool. Think of how much happier everyone would be if you shared it. You're acting like it's some sacred treasure." Josh held his ground, explaining calmly that the pool was private property built for his family and that Karen's claims were false. Elaine scoffed and walked away, muttering under her breath. The pressure began to intensify. Josh noticed more people lingering near his property, peering into his backyard as though staking a claim. That evening, he called Karen directly. She answered in her usual syrupy tone, but her words were sharp. "I simply told the truth, Josh," she said, cutting him off mid-sentence when he tried to refute her letter. "If you're feeling pressured, it's not my doing. The community deserves to know the facts." Josh's patience snapped. "This is defamation, Karen. You know I never agreed to any of this." "Defamation?" Karen's voice hardened. "I haven't broken any HOA rules nor any laws, but since you brought it up, I've noticed some questionable issues with your property. You might want to prepare for a compliance inspection soon. Just a friendly heads up." The line went dead. Josh sat in stunned silence, the weight of her veiled threat settling heavily on his shoulders. He realized then that Karen wasn't just interested in his pool. She was waging a campaign against him, and the battle had only just begun. The first notice came in the mail less than a week after Josh's tense phone call with Karen. Marked with the HOA's official seal, it cited violations that were as baffling as they were infuriating. The pool's lighting was deemed excessively bright, supposedly disrupting the neighborhood's aesthetic harmony. The accompanying fine was $150. Shaking his head, he set the letter aside, chalking it up to an error. But over the next few days, more notices followed. One claimed his backyard fence exceeded the allowable height, despite the fact that it had been approved during the pool's construction. Another alleged that water runoff from the pool's filter was causing damage to communal landscaping, an outlandish claim given the pool's self-contained drainage system. Each violation carried its own fine, and by the end of the week, the total had climbed to nearly $600. The inspections began soon after. Clipboard in hand, Karen strode onto his property with the air of a battlefield general, ignoring his protests. "Routine compliance check," she declared breezily, though her eyes darted straight toward the backyard. "You need permission to step onto my property," Josh said firmly, blocking her path. Karen offered a saccharine smile. "The HOA bylaws give us the authority to inspect any property for violations. If you've got nothing to hide, this shouldn't be a problem." Josh clenched his fists at his sides as the trio pushed past him. They circled the pool, muttering to each other and taking notes, while Karen snapped photos of everything from the water's edge to the seating area. Before leaving, she handed Josh a curt notice. "We'll be in touch," she said, her tone a mix of triumph and mock sympathy. Within days, Josh found himself buried in more fines and notices. Some were for minor infractions such as improper storage of pool equipment, while others were outright fabricated. A letter accused him of holding unauthorized events, referencing his monthly barbecues. It warned that future gatherings could lead to more severe penalties. Karen's campaign extended beyond official channels. She began spreading rumors that Josh's pool construction had caused property values to dip, even suggesting he had cut corners during the process. The whispers reached Josh through neighbors who were increasingly uneasy about siding with him publicly. Yet, not everyone turned against him. His longtime friend, Tom Grayson, remained a steadfast ally. "This is harassment, plain and simple," Tom said, helping Josh sort through the mounting paperwork. "She's trying to make you crack under the pressure." Others, like an older couple named the Petersons, quietly admitted they were also receiving unexplained fines for trivial matters, such as their mailbox being slightly tilted. "She's targeting anyone who doesn't fall in line," Mrs. Peterson confided. Determined not to let Karen break him, Josh began documenting everything. He kept copies of every notice, recorded the dates and times of the inspections, and even installed additional cameras around his property to capture any unauthorized entries. The pressure, however, was relentless. Karen ramped up her efforts, calling for a special HOA meeting to discuss ongoing community concerns. Josh attended, bracing himself for the inevitable confrontation. The meeting room buzzed with tension as Karen took the podium. She spoke in vague but pointed terms about selfish behavior and residents who put their own interests above the community's well-being. Though she never mentioned Josh by name, everyone knew who she meant. When Josh tried to defend himself, Karen cut him off, citing time constraints. Her supporters nodded along while others exchanged uneasy glances, unwilling to challenge her openly. By the time the meeting ended, Josh was more determined than ever to fight back. Karen wasn't just trying to control his property. She was waging a war on his reputation and his right to live peacefully. And if she thought he would back down, she had underestimated him. Josh Carmichael had always believed in the power of community, but Karen Dalton's relentless campaign was testing the limits of his patience. After weeks of fines, inspections, and thinly veiled threats, Josh decided he could no longer sit back and wait for things to spiral further out of control. If Karen wanted a fight, he would give her one, but on his terms. The first step in Josh's counterattack was simple: documentation. With the help of his longtime friend Tom Grayson, Josh created a detailed timeline of every interaction, inspection, and notice he had received from the HOA since the beginning of the ordeal. He paired these with video recordings from the security cameras he had installed around his property. The footage included Karen's intrusive inspections, her team's unauthorized photo sessions in his backyard, and even neighbors peering through his fence after receiving her infamous letter. Next, Josh hired a lawyer specializing in property disputes and HOA conflicts. Margaret Hayes, a no-nonsense attorney with years of experience taking on overreaching HOAs, agreed to take his case. During their first meeting, she reviewed the evidence with a raised eyebrow and a faint smile. "You've got a solid case here," she said, tapping the stack of documents. "What Karen is doing goes beyond HOA authority. This isn't about rules, it's about power." Margaret suggested Josh take additional measures to protect himself. He added more cameras to cover blind spots in his backyard and front porch. He also set up an encrypted backup system for his recordings, ensuring no tampering could compromise his evidence. But Josh knew Karen wasn't just targeting him. Other neighbors were also suffering. Quietly, he began reaching out to those who had expressed dissatisfaction with Karen's leadership. The Petersons, still fuming over their tilted mailbox fine, shared their own stories of arbitrary penalties and invasive inspections. Another neighbor, a single mother named Sandra, revealed she had been fined for parking her son's basketball hoop too close to the curb. As the stories piled up, Josh realized the pattern. Karen targeted anyone who opposed her or refused to comply with her personal vision for Pinewood Hills. Together with Tom and Margaret, Josh began organizing these neighbors into a coalition. Their goal was clear: to document Karen's abuses, build a case against her, and if possible, push for her removal as HOA president. Meanwhile, Josh took steps to secure his family's privacy. Knowing Karen might escalate her tactics, he temporarily restricted access to the pool for his wife and kids. To protect the pool itself, he added a harmless but irritating substance to the water, one that caused mild skin irritation but posed no real danger. It was a calculated move, one designed to deter Karen and her allies should they attempt another unauthorized swim. Karen, of course, didn't back down. She doubled her efforts, sending yet another inspection team to Josh's property. This time, she showed up in broad daylight with a clipboard and 2 HOA board members in tow. Ignoring Josh's objections, Karen brazenly marched into his backyard, pointing out violations that didn't exist. Josh stood firm. "You're trespassing, Karen," he said, his voice steady but cold. "Leave now or I'll call the police." Karen smirked. "Call them," she said. "I've done nothing wrong, and you know it. But let me warn you, refusing to cooperate with HOA inspections is a serious offense. You're only making this harder on yourself." Josh didn't take the bait. Instead, he filmed the entire encounter, making sure to capture Karen's smug expression and dismissive tone. As she left, he noticed her glancing at the pool, her eyes narrowing. That evening, Margaret called with an update. She had drafted a formal cease and desist letter addressed to Karen and the HOA, demanding they halt all harassment and refrain from further unauthorized entries onto Josh's property. She had also reviewed the HOA bylaws, finding multiple instances where Karen's actions clearly overstepped her authority. "Her position is weaker than she thinks," Margaret assured Josh. "If she continues, she's not just risking her presidency, she's exposing herself and the HOA to legal liability." Buoyed by Margaret's confidence and the growing support from his neighbors, Josh felt a renewed sense of determination. He wasn't just fighting for his pool or his property, he was standing up for the rights of everyone in Pinewood Hills. And as the evidence mounted, he knew it was only a matter of time before Karen's house of cards came crashing down. It was a blistering Saturday afternoon when Josh Carmichael's worst fears were realized. While reviewing footage from his security cameras, he noticed an unmistakable figure entering his backyard. Karen Dalton, clad in an oversized sun hat and designer sunglasses, marched confidently through the side gate, followed by 3 neighbors carrying pool floats, coolers, and towels. The group moved with a brazen arrogance, as if Josh's backyard had magically become public property. Josh's jaw clenched as he watched the scene unfold on the live feed. Karen, wasting no time, gestured theatrically at the pool, her voice carrying over to the cameras. "Now this," she announced to her entourage, "is how a real community amenity should look. Gorgeous, isn't it?" The group laughed, nodding in agreement. Josh's heart pounded as Karen dipped her toes into the pool, smirking before sliding into the water with exaggerated grace. Her companions followed her lead, settling into lounge chairs or dangling their feet into the water. For a moment, Josh considered storming outside and confronting them on the spot. But then he remembered Margaret Hayes' advice: patience and evidence. Instead, he calmly grabbed his phone and called the police. While waiting for their arrival, Josh continued monitoring the group through his cameras. Karen swam leisurely, her smug expression grating on his nerves. But it wasn't long before the unexpected happened. As Karen floated to the edge of the pool, she suddenly began scratching at her arms and neck. Her companions watched in confusion as red blotches spread across her skin. "What is this?" Karen barked, her voice rising in panic as she climbed out of the pool. She furiously scratched at her legs, her irritation growing more visible with every passing second. The others hesitated, their laughter dying as they noticed her increasingly splotchy appearance. "Maybe it's the water," one of her friends muttered nervously. "It smells weird." Karen spun around, glaring at the pool. "What did that maniac do?" she hissed. At that moment, Josh stepped outside, his phone in hand. He was calm, deliberate, and utterly unimpressed by the scene in front of him. "Karen," he said, his voice carrying an air of authority, "what exactly are you doing on my property?" Karen turned to him, her face a mix of rage and discomfort. "You poisoned your pool," she shouted, pointing an accusatory finger. "You're going to pay for this." Josh crossed his arms. First, this is my private property, and you're trespassing. Second, I have no idea what you're talking about. He gestured toward one of the security cameras mounted on the patio. Everything you've done here is recorded, and I've already called the police. Karen's companions exchanged uneasy glances. One of them began gathering her belongings, mumbling an excuse about having to leave early. Karen, however, was not ready to back down. She stepped closer to Josh, ignoring the angry red welts forming on her arms. "You think you're clever, don't you?" she spat. "I've tried to be reasonable, but you're just too stubborn to see what's best for this community. Mark my words, Carmichael, you won't last here much longer." Before Josh could respond, the sound of sirens cut through the tension. 2 police cruisers pulled up in front of the house, their lights flashing. Officers stepped out, their presence immediately shifting the dynamic. Karen's bravado wavered as the officers approached. "Sir, is there an issue here?" one of the officers asked Josh, scanning the group by the pool. "There certainly is," Josh replied, maintaining his composure. "These individuals have trespassed on my property without permission. I've got everything recorded, including prior incidents." Karen's face flushed as she turned to the officers. "This is absurd," she exclaimed, her tone tinged with desperation. "I'm the HOA president. I have every right to be here. This pool belongs to the community." The officer raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, private property laws are clear. If you're on this man's property without his consent, you're trespassing. Being part of the HOA doesn't give you authority over his land." Karen sputtered, struggling for words. He sabotaged the pool. Look at me." She gestured to her blotchy skin, hoping to shift the blame. Josh remained calm. "The pool's been off limits to everyone, including my family. I've taken precautions to protect it after repeated intrusions, all of which I've documented." He handed the officer a folder prepared by Margaret containing printed screenshots, timestamps, and detailed accounts of Karen's harassment. The officer reviewed the evidence, his expression hardening. "Ma'am," he said, turning to Karen, "we're going to need you to come with us for questioning." Karen's confidence crumbled as the officer gestured for her to step aside. Her companions, already halfway to the gate, slipped away, muttering apologies. Karen, however, was not done. "This isn't over, Carmichael," she yelled as she was escorted to the cruiser, her threats losing their sting against the weight of her exposed wrongdoing. Josh stood silently as the police drove away, feeling the first glimmer of relief in weeks. He had faced Karen's arrogance head-on, and for the first time he had turned the tide in his favor. But he knew the fight wasn't over. With the evidence he'd gathered and Margaret's expertise, the battle would now shift to a courtroom, and Josh was ready for it. Karen Dalton's arrogance had been her undoing, and the consequences of her actions unfolded swiftly. The evidence Josh Carmichael had meticulously gathered, video recordings, documentation of her unauthorized visits, and her threats, proved damning when reviewed by the authorities. Within days of her dramatic trespass, Karen faced official charges for criminal trespass, harassment, and misuse of her HOA authority. The police investigation uncovered even more. Margaret Hayes, Josh's sharp-witted lawyer, had requested an audit of Karen's actions as HOA president. It revealed a trail of corruption, fabricated fines, unauthorized inspections, and doctored documents used to intimidate residents. Karen had exploited her position to serve her own interests, and Pinewood Hills became a neighborhood united not in admiration, but in outrage. At her court appearance, Karen's composure crumbled. Gone was the smug confidence she had wielded so ruthlessly. She now faced not just the Carmichaels, but a collective of neighbors who had also suffered under her rule. The charges against her, compounded by evidence of falsified HOA records, left her with little room to maneuver. The judge's verdict was decisive. Karen was sentenced to a 3-year prison term for her abuses of power and ordered to pay substantial fines to both the Carmichaels and the HOA. Her arrest was not just a victory for Josh, but a turning point for Pinewood Hills, marking the end of an era of unchecked authority. For Josh, the moment was bittersweet. Though justice had been served, the toll of the ordeal lingered. Still, as Karen was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, Josh felt a weight lift. The battle was over, and the neighborhood could finally begin to heal. With Karen Dalton removed from power and the HOA under scrutiny, Pinewood Hills began a slow but meaningful transformation. The audit Margaret Hayes initiated didn't just expose Karen's abuses, it forced the HOA to confront its flaws. New leadership was quickly installed, with the presidency passing to a retired judge, Thomas Whitaker, who prioritized fairness and transparency. His first order of business was to revoke all baseless fines issued under Karen's tenure and rewrite the HOA bylaws to prevent future misuse of authority. For Josh Carmichael, the victory was more than personal. His fight had inspired the community to stand up against tyranny, and his neighbors rallied together to rebuild trust. Formerly passive residents now joined HOA meetings, ensuring no single person could wield unchecked power again. To celebrate the victory and restore the camaraderie Pinewood Hills was known for, Josh hosted a grand barbecue in his backyard. Friends and neighbors filled the space, laughter echoing as kids splashed in the newly cleaned and refilled pool. Josh took a moment to reflect, watching the people he'd fought for enjoy the very space that had sparked so much conflict. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Tom Grayson raised a toast. To Josh, he declared, for standing up for what's right and showing us all how to fight back with courage and integrity. Cheers erupted, and for the first time in months, Josh allowed himself to relax. The battle with Karen had been exhausting, but it had brought lasting change. Pinewood Hills was no longer just a neighborhood. It was a community, united by shared resolve and a newfound respect for one another's rights. For Josh, it wasn't just a victory. It was the affirmation of everything he believed in: fairness, family, and the power of standing up to injustice.